Well, welcome everyone to tonight's program that is part of the NEA Big Read, sponsored by the National Endowment for the Arts in partnership with Arts Midwest and Libraries in the Woods. I'm Aaron Falble, Head of Adult Services and, for 11 more days, Acting Director of the Sunderland Public Library, while our actual director, Catherine Umstadt, is on temporary leave. As you may know, the idea behind the Big Read is that everyone reads the same book to spur community-wide discussions, events, and programs on a common set of themes or ideas. Libraries in the Woods is a group of about 20 or so libraries in our area, and they are all involved in the Big Read. This year's Big Read book is the dystopian post-apocalyptic novel Station 11 by Emily St. John Mandel. It deals with a global pandemic, one far more lethal than our current one, which causes a global collapse of society. Actually, this book was chosen some months before the COVID-19 pandemic appeared upon the scene, and it was chosen by the Pecumtuck Valley Memorial Association for other reasons not having to do with the pandemic. Tonight's program is not a discussion of the book itself. We will have one of those on Monday, May 24th, but rather a presentation and discussion related to the themes mentioned in the book. Two of those themes are trauma and loss, obvious consequences of a global pandemic. Toward that end, we have invited Sunderland resident, author, and therapist Susannah Sheffer to lead us in a discussion about coping with trauma and loss, how therapy can help. Ms. Sheffer is a licensed mental health counselor and therapist with clinical and support options in Greenfield. She also maintains a private practice in Amherst. As a writer and researcher, she has interviewed many people who have experienced traumatic loss. She's also worked in the criminal justice field with such organizations as Murder Victims' Families for Human Rights and the Texas After Violence Project. She is the author of several books, including In a Dark Time, co-authored with Dwight Harrison, and Fighting for Their Lives Inside the Experience of Capital Defense Attorneys. This is an introductory program for those who are curious about the therapeutic process, how it works, and how it may be employed as a response to trauma and loss. Ms. Sheffer will talk about these subjects for about 30 minutes or so, and then we'll open it up to questions and discussion from all of our participants. Please make sure that your computer or mobile device is muted throughout the program unless you are the one speaking. Thank you. We will be recording tonight's event for use on our unlisted YouTube channel, available only to library patrons who obtain the link from us. So, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Susannah Sheffer, who will speak about coping with trauma and loss, how therapy can help.
Thank you. And thanks to everybody for coming. So these are such big topics, and there's all kinds of things that one could say and that I specifically could say. So I've chosen some things that I want to share with you and talk with you about. And I'll talk for, roughly 30 minutes, maybe a little less or more or something, as Aaron said. And then we'll see what questions you have. So I'll probably just talk for a while without pausing for questions. But if you have a question that you notice, that comes to you as I'm saying something and you don't want to forget it, please feel free to either just make your own note of it or write it in the chat or, whatever is comfortable for you. And no question is a foolish question. No question is too, don't worry that it's too basic or too, well, everybody knows this or whatever. Any question is welcome, and we'll see if I can speak to it. So people ask me sometimes what it's like to spend so much time thinking about and interacting with trauma. And one thing that I think of when I think of how to answer that question is that I think trauma is in many ways about how vulnerable we humans are, how things happen that overwhelm us and how we can be hurt by so many things that happen or that other people do. But trauma is also I think, and trauma work, response to trauma, shows us so much about our human ability to adapt, to try to survive in so many senses of the word. So for me, the whole thing is sort of part of the human condition, that if we weren't so alive, which means so susceptible, if things didn't matter to us, then we wouldn't be so affected by what happens, and loss wouldn't hurt so much. So it kind of comes with being alive. And, what would the cost be of the alternative of sort of not being susceptible, not being affected by stuff that happens? That might be a cost that we wouldn't want to pay. So I find working in response to trauma, of course, challenging and sometimes, really discouraging or maddening and saddening. But I also find it very poignant and sort of very dear in this way, because it shows so much about humans. And so then in the end, in some ways, also very hopeful. And I hope to give you a sense of that in my brief remarks. So let's talk a bit about what trauma is. It's a word that gets said a lot these days, and it's kind of funny how sometimes when something is mentioned a lot, it can seem as though, oh, everyone kind of knows what it is because it just, we say it so much. But sometimes when things get mentioned so much, it's sort of, we forget what it actually means. We kind of use it to talk about a whole lot of things. So is a bad thing or a frightening thing, let's say, automatically traumatic? Like if I see something scary or something bad happens to me, is that by definition traumatic? Well, not necessarily. Something could be bad or scary or disturbing or distressing or whatever without being traumatic. Something is traumatic when it overwhelms our ability to process it, to cope with it, when we can't take that thing in and assimilate it into our lives and move forward. On a sort of physiological level, something's traumatic if it overwhelms our nervous system, and then that overwhelm changes the way we remember what happened, and then changes the way we respond, which, I'll talk about that in a minute. So something scary or unpleasant or otherwise, yucky or bad isn't necessarily, or it isn't in itself traumatic. The traumatic impact depends on, let's say, my ability to cope with it, to calm myself down afterward, and then to integrate all that into my experience and be able to go forward. So for example, and I'll take just one example for us to kind of work with. Let's say there's a really loud noise that startles me. That isn't traumatic if my nervous system can cope with that impact, with the startle. If I'm able to take that in and then regulate myself, that's a fancy word for saying sort of, like calm down from the startle. If I can do that afterward, either through my own efforts or if by seeking comfort from others to help me do that, if I can do all that, then that loud noise, it's loud, it's disturbing or startling or whatever, but it's not traumatic. But if the impact of that loud noise is, for whatever reason, more than my nervous system can handle, so I can't calm myself, so I kind of stay, like on permanent alarm mode, permanent high alert, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. So if I can't calm down, or maybe I responded to that loud noise by sort of like shutting down, like not hearing it, kind of numbing, shutting down my senses. Maybe that's how I coped. And then if afterwards I can't come out of that, so I kind of stay there. And, or if now that all that happened, my whole sense of safety in the world is affected. So I don't feel safe as I go about my day because I'm always kind of alert to the next bad thing. These are examples. This gives you a sense maybe of what makes something not just be bad, but be traumatic. Now, what about, this is related, but what about if the circumstances in which I heard that startling loud noise were such, and you can imagine what this might include, what if they were such that at that time, in that circumstance, a loud noise meant grave danger? Maybe loud noise was actually a signal of something really dangerous. So it actually made sense for me to be on high alert, and it was actually correct to interpret loud noise as a sign of danger, right? Because maybe that was actually true at the time. The issue with trauma, what makes it traumatic, would be that I would then get stuck there. kind of like from key parts of my brain, I'm no longer able to recognize that now things are different. Circumstances have changed, and the loud noise doesn't necessarily mean that I'm in danger now. So that brings us to a really key point here. Something I want to, if you take one thing away, I kind of want it to be this stuff that human beings, we humans, we're so good at adapting. We adapt to whatever we need to adapt to survive, to take care of ourselves. So it's a really significant part of understanding all this stuff I'm talking about and of working with it in therapy to see things like symptoms, things that some people call symptoms or difficulties, as at some point having had a necessary, adaptive, even protective function. At some point, that thing made sense. So, what am I talking about? Let me give some examples. That one I just mentioned, that maybe there was a time when I actually needed to be that alert because I was in some kind of danger. And, maybe like you could think of it as like the smoke alarm needed to be really sensitive because there was often occasions of smoke and fire. So, or maybe, I needed to be poised to get away from a predator because there was that risk. So at one time, my being on high alert, my being very sensitive to any noise or whatever, just using that as an example, maybe I needed to be paying attention all the time because not paying attention would have been dangerous. So you see where this is going. At one time, all those responses made sense. That's not the problem. The problem, in other words, where it gets to be trauma is if now I'm in a different circumstance, now I'm technically safe, but my nervous system doesn't know it. So I'm still behaving like there's the threat. And that word triggers, you hear, it's another one of these words that you hear people say sort of all the time now, in that way that they'll, people sort of use it about anything. Triggers, one way to think about it is that that word, that concept refers to things that may not be bad in themselves, but as I was saying, at one time, the thing was a sign of danger or it came to be associated with danger. If something horrible happens to me while I happen to be glancing up at a tree and that tree is an oak tree, my brain may come to associate oak leaves with bad, with danger, or smells, sounds, textures, whatever was present at the time of the overwhelming thing. And again, this is not a bad thing in itself that this happens. The brain is trying to learn connections, what's dangerous, and it can be useful for us humans to associate one thing to another, right? I mean, like, just think for a moment, like, we want to know that a hot stove is dangerous. We want to learn from things that happen and learn to associate this with that. It's not like that's always a bad thing, but think of the hot stove, right? We want to know a hot stove is dangerous. So we want to learn from the first time we encountered a hot stove, but we don't want to react without thinking to any stove. That's the key difference. We want to be able to, in our lives, be in the present enough that we can assess, and assess is a big word because of course it's all happening fast, but I want to be able to check out and see, is this stove actually hot and dangerous or is it not? I want to be able to assess it. So my brain, it's good if my brain can connect one thing to another, but if what happens in trauma is, again, it sort of gets stuck, it's made that connection, and now anytime I see, let's say, an oak tree, I react as though the thing that happened before is happening now. A couple of other quick examples of this, right? What if numbing, as I said before, what if shutting down, kind of not feeling what's going on, was what my nervous system had to do to survive at the time? You hear a lot about fight or flight. That's become a kind of another common phrase. One of the things that this wonderful researcher named Stephen Porges, Porges, has taught us is that freeze is what the human animal and actually other animals will go to if fight or flight isn't available, right? What if we can't get away? What if you can't fight? What if that would be more dangerous? Our nervous systems will go to freeze, shut down. So I'm saying all that to say, what if that was the useful, safer thing to do at the time? Or maybe dissociating, taking our minds away even though our body is still there. Maybe that was really helpful at the time when the bad thing or many bad things were happening. The issue, as I'm saying, I'm just going to keep kind of returning to this theme in various ways. The issue is, what if it gets us into trouble later? It was useful or necessary at the time, but now we're still reacting that way. A couple of other examples. I'm going to say these real fast, and if any one of these interests you more, we can talk about it when in the questions. But a wonderful researcher and therapist named Janina Fisher talks about examples like, I just mentioned this one because it's less obvious, but maybe in somebody's childhood it wasn't safe to show enthusiasm or to be interested in something. Like kids will say, I learned that if I didn't show any interest in something, then they wouldn't take it away. Or maybe it wasn't safe to speak up in somebody's circumstance or to stand up for yourself. Maybe the safest thing was to be really agreeable, figure out what other people want. I'm throwing in those examples just to kind of move it away from maybe what might seem more obviously to you like danger, and just all kinds of circumstances where a person figures out what is going to be the sort of most protective, safest, necessary thing, and then it works at the time, but maybe it's not so helpful later. So we can talk more about this. But so a crucial thing that therapy does, beginning to talk about that, is to ask a question of whatever a person's arriving with and saying, this is a problem. This is getting in my way. This is bothering me now. This is a challenge. This is messing with my life in this way or that way, the other way. A crucial thing that therapy will do is begin to ask, well, how did that, whatever that thing is, how did it keep you safe at one time? How was it useful or necessary at one time or in one circumstance? Maybe it might be, how did that thing, that behavior, that way of responding help to keep your caregivers, the people crucial to you? How did it help to keep them close to you? How was it useful to you? All right, a couple of other things. So one thing that might not be obvious also is that when we're talking about trauma now, or certainly when I'm talking about it, we're not just talking about one single bad thing that happened. I mean, it could be that, right? It could be, one terrible car accident, one experience of violence or violation, one earthquake. Of course it could be one terrible thing. But a lot of the time, and this is something that the field of trauma research has really come a long way over the past couple of decades in understanding, is that a lot of the time it's a whole series of events throughout one's life, or a whole context in which a lot of things happen that are overwhelming. And again, we can talk more about that if that's interesting. So, I was just talking to you briefly just now about this question, right? How did this keep you safe when the dangerous thing was happening? Here's a crucial thing I didn't yet say, and that really needs to be said here. A really important thing to understand about trauma is that all these adaptations that I'm talking about, they're not conscious, right? They're not, you don't think of them. They weren't conscious at the time, and they're not conscious now at the later point. So it's not like, a human organism who's in peril in some way and whose nervous system adapts by shutting down, or who has made that association between that oak tree or the green hat or the smell of cookies, whatever it might be. Brain has made the association between that and the scary thing. It's not like that's thought out. The mind doesn't say, okay, this is what I'm going to do to keep myself safe. And similarly, now, later, the mind doesn't think it through. These aren't conscious deliberations, and so it doesn't feel like a choice. It doesn't feel like a decision, and it's not. It actually is not, which is why, and if anyone can connect with this as I'm saying it, this is why someone who's having a trauma response can feel crazy. Because maybe, let's say, for example, there are so many examples, but let's say the person's gone into a panic. Maybe they've run out of a room. It was a green hat that their brain associated with danger at some earlier time, and now they're at some social event and someone's got a green hat, and before they even know it, our person's running out of the room, or their heart is racing, or whatever it might be. And it doesn't seem to make sense because it wasn't a thought out, oh, let me see, I'm making that connection. All of this happens before the thinking part of the brain has even had a chance to catch up and recognize that in this case, right now, there's no threat. And this is also why, however we typically respond to life now, can feel just sort of like the way things are. Like this is just how it is, rather than one option among a lot of options. We don't see that, let's say, a pattern of not speaking up, like I was saying before, as a adaptation to an earlier context. We just think of it as that's the way things are. Maybe we think that's the way we are. Trauma researchers have taught us that the reason this happens, like without thought, without conscious deliberation, is that it's actually helpful for survival to just, have it happen as an automatic connection, that this worked for survival at one time. And so the brain kind of goes, oh, let's make that the default. If that's what kept me safe at this earlier time, like if fighting is what worked, if one time I got it, or many times, more likely over a whole period of my life, the most helpful thing, the thing that kept me safest was to fight, then the brain's going to kind of make that the default, and you might look like someone with, anger issues. Or maybe shutting down. Going numb was the thing that worked most reliably in the past. And so the brain defaults to that, and that might look like depression. Here's another interesting thing. There's one more of these sort of, science type of research things that because it's really interesting and important, I think, that traumatic memories, all this stuff I've been talking about, don't get kind of laid down in our brain as chronological memories. That's a fancy way of saying we don't remember traumatic things in a kind of this happened, so then I did this, so then this other thing happened. And the researchers tell us that it's like that because it's actually more efficient. Like if I'm in danger, immediate danger, I don't have time to go, let me see, what did I do originally when this happened? Think it through. It sort of works better in the moment of danger if my nervous system just goes instantaneous. Okay, that's danger. My heart starts racing. My body does what it does when I'm in danger. That would be useful if a wild animal really were coming at me or whatever. But again, what if I'm not? So here's something else that might help make sense of how trauma works. Okay, I'll give you an example. When you have a memory, let me invite you to remember, what you did yesterday, what you had for breakfast yesterday, or, make it something else easy if that one doesn't come to you. The last time you took a walk, the last time you went swimming, like whatever. I'm just throwing out some examples. As you remember that, as I invite you to remember that, remember the last time you had chocolate. Remember the last conversation you had with a family member. Giving you examples. Remember waking up this morning. My guess is that that's a memory. Maybe it's really vivid. Maybe you can feel the taste of that chocolate or you remember the conversation or whatever, but that it's a memory, that it's not happening now. It's funny, right? But your mind can tell the difference. With trauma, it feels as though it's happening right now. That's actually what trauma is in a way. It's another way of saying what trauma is. The body reacts as though the thing is happening now. That's what flashbacks are. You may have heard that term. Flashbacks, what that really is somebody's experiencing something that technically happened in the past, but it feels like it's happening now. So your whole body is not saying, oh, I remember that terrible time when I was in danger. The body is going, I am in danger now. Okay, turning the curve to just a few other thoughts about what we do to help with all this. One of the first things we do in therapy is help people notice, and not with judgment, not with what's wrong with you or how ridiculous it is that you responded that way, not I'm crazy, but this is how I adapted. So noticing with curiosity and care, what are your responses? What does happen inside you? And needs to be said, this is a process over time. It's not one quick fix. It's not trauma therapy or any kind of therapy. Isn't like going to the doctor and saying, these are my symptoms and here's the doctor gives you some medicine. This is a process. But so I'll say a couple of things about this. And again, we can talk more, depending on your interests. But a lot of therapy involves just noticing what's happening, what's going on inside you, learning to see what's been sort of your default, what's your automatic response, and maybe gradually beginning to learn to put some space between your unthinking reaction and some kind of choice. I talk about this sometimes with people as learning to have a pause button where you could feel a thing, but there's actually some space between you feeling it and any kind of thing you might do. I feel so angry I want to punch the person, but I've actually got a pause button now where I don't have to do that necessarily. I can choose. Noticing internal sensations, noticing what's going on inside you, that can be really new for a lot of folks. And I'm be curious how you're all, connecting with this. A lot of therapy is about noticing what story are you telling yourself without even realizing it about what happened. And that can come up a lot with respect to loss. We tell ourselves stories like this person left, or this bad thing happened because of something about me or something I did. So a lot of therapy is sort of uncovering what has been the story you might have been telling yourself about whatever it is without even realizing it. All right, there's a fun example we can do if this is interesting to people, where you can kind of catch and like notice your own default reactions, but I'll save that for if people are interested in it. I want to just tell you a couple of other things, presenting kind of things. I said we learn in therapy to sort of notice more about what's going on inside us. So here's a way to think about this maybe. When things are going well, like when we're not having a trauma response, our internal sensations, in other words, what we feel inside, are actually useful information. And I'll tell you real simply, like if I can sense that I'm hungry, that's going to be a signal that I need some nourishment. If I can sense internally my sensation that I'm cold, that prompts me to do something about it. And then more in what we think of as the feeling realm, if I sense that I'm scared, I sense that I'm sad, I sense that I'm lonely, like whatever it might be, if I sense what's going on, if things are going well, that's information that I can take and use, because it can prompt me to do something about it. But with trauma, it's another one of these key what is trauma things. The emotions, the stuff going on inside me it's like too much, it's too extreme, it's more than I can handle, or it's too quiet. Like I can't even tell what's going on inside me. So it's either like way too overwhelming, or I don't have enough ability to sense it. Sometimes I work with people who just don't even know what's going on. They're not used to checking, and for good reason, again, because at one time that was dangerous. So we people who are experiencing trauma just maybe don't feel their internal stuff as reliable, useful information. And another crucial thing, don't feel like internal sensations are tolerable. It feels like I cannot bear this. This is more than I can handle to feel this. And crucially, don't feel like we can do anything about it. And imagine if the sensation of being cold, let's say, I'm just picking a simple one, never meant that you could do anything about it, never meant, oh, cold, better put on some socks, oh, cold, better put on a jacket, and I know I'm able to do that. If I'm not able to do that, it might actually be more adaptive for me to shut off that signal and not even to feel cold in the first place. So this is the sort of thing, I'm giving you a sense of what can happen in trauma. So a lot of what goes on in therapy is helping people to notice and tolerate internal states, learning that what you feel now won't last forever, learning that we can shift it, that you can actually do things to help shift what's going on inside, and that you can turn to others to help with that, because that's a whole big point that I'll just mention in one sentence and that we can go into if you're interested. That a big issue with trauma, of course, is how it messes with our sense that other people are safe and can be turned to for safety. It can be trusted to help us feel better. A healthy baby needs to turn to older person to help feel better. If things go okay, we kind of know we can do that. But with trauma, it's not reliable anymore. So this is a way of saying that a lot of trauma work is actually about being able to live fully in the present. And here we have another thing that gets said a lot, gets thrown around a lot as a term, but you can begin to see the deeper way that that's meant here. If trauma is about sort of being stuck in the past, feeling the past as present, not I was in danger then, but feeling it like I'm in danger now. So kind of like trapped in the past as though it's the present. A lot of healing is about being able to be actually present. Is this stove hot? I'm right here in the moment with this stove, with this person, with this experience, and I can assess whether I'm safe or not. A lot of therapy is about helping realize that feelings will shift, as I said, that you can actually do things to help it shift, that it won't last forever. People do interesting work in therapy helping people to regain a sense of time. Let's feel this for a couple of minutes and then do something else, having a sense of transition of time. I'm going to wrap up with just a couple of thoughts about types of therapy. I'm going to say something, I'll choose one thing to say about this, that one thing that surprises people, or some people anyway, I don't know about you folks, about therapy, is that it isn't just talking. I think a lot of people out there in the world sort of think, well, you go and you talk to someone. And of course, it's that. And there's all kinds of reasons why that can be amazing and important, especially if it's things you haven't felt able to talk about, etc. There's all kinds of things to say about why that can be amazing. But it's not just talking. And I mean a couple of things by that. Thing one that I mean by that is everything I've summarized real briefly just now about the nervous system being overwhelmed and internal sensations and all of that stuff that I just kind of barreled through saying to you all of that means that a lot of really effective trauma therapy will incorporate and encourage people to incorporate in their rest of their lives some way of becoming more comfortable in one's body, learning to sense and tolerate and manage whatever you experience internally, whether that's hunger or fatigue or coldness or fear or anger or sadness or anything. Learning to feel okay in your body. And as I mentioned before, establishing a sense of time. I'll just give you a quick example. Why is yoga often so helpful for trauma? Because people will do things in a yoga class like the teacher will say, okay, hold this pose. It's uncomfortable maybe. We'll hold it for 3 breaths. And people begin to feel in their bodies, okay, 3 breaths. That's not forever. This is something that has a beginning and a middle and an end, which is what trauma doesn't feel like. Trauma feels like this is just forever, kind of continuous present. A lot of really interesting and innovative trauma therapies in response to trauma in the past, again, sort of decade or two, have something to do with physical work. And again, I'm just saying this as one sentence. We can talk more about it if it intrigues you, but how to discharge the stored energy, how to complete the action, the thing. Maybe you had to suppress the desire to get away at the time that something bad happened, and how can you do physical things that help you kind of carry through and do that thing you couldn't do. But, last thought, even talk therapy isn't just about talking. And I feel that is very important to me because I mostly do what we call talk therapy, but it isn't actually just talking. It's really about experiencing and noticing and reflecting and experimenting. So there's a lot of what happens if you do this? What happens if you do that? And it could be a physical movement. The therapist Janina Fisher will just have people like, what happens if you straighten your spine? Just notice. So it could be physical, but it could be a lot of other things that don't seem physical, like what happens if you talk to yourself this way or that way? Noticing. Using therapy to notice, what does it feel like to be in this situation? What does it feel like to be here with me talking? What does it feel like? What are you worrying that I'm thinking? What feels safe and what doesn't feel safe here? And so it brings me to, I want to mention before I wrap up this part that a big reason that therapy is not just talking is that it's a relationship between two people, and it's a chance to experience being with someone in a way that might be very different from how one is used to being with someone. And an interesting thing about conversations in therapy that are usually different from just ordinary conversations in life is that the conversation in therapy kind of goes back and forth between having an encounter and observing it. So in other words, you might have an exchange with a therapist, and then I kind of gesture because it's like you come over here and observe, well, now what was that? What just happened between us? When I said this, what happened inside you? I noticed you seemed like that, whatever. So it's kind of having the moment and then observing the moment and reflecting on it. And doing that can help to kind of bring to light how one responds. Oh, I felt like I was worried you were angry there. I was afraid to tell you this because I was thinking you might react this way or that way or the other. Or it's when you had that expression on your face, it seemed to me like you were judging me, or, whatever it is that might be going on. And getting to talk about that in therapy is actually really different from how we just talk about that with people in our lives. So that's a big part of it. All right, last presentation kind of point is I've been talking a lot about safety, right? I've said, when you were safe, weren't safe, felt safe, etc. So of course, safety is primary in therapy, and you will hear that phrase safe space and create a safe space. And of course, that's crucial. We can talk more about that if that's interesting and important to you, how that's done. So absolutely. And of course, because so much of trauma is about loss of control, helplessness and so forth, of course, it is crucial for someone in therapy to feel in control and able to make choices and able to say no and all those things that are, opposite of helpless. But this is my last point. The researcher Dan Siegel coined a term that gets used a lot now called the window of tolerance. And what that means is kind of like the zone where you're not overwhelmed. You can tolerate what's going on. So you're not like shut down or zoned out or too agitated so you can't cope with it. You're somewhere in that zone that isn't shut down or too agitated. And one way to talk about a goal of therapy is that we want to widen that zone so that often in therapy we'll consider it sort of a good thing if people can tolerate a greater range of feelings. That's why therapists don't think, it's one of the many reasons therapists don't think it's a bad thing if somebody gets really upset or expresses a lot of feeling in a session, because maybe what they're doing is widening their window of tolerance. They can feel more things and not either shut down or become too agitated. So in therapy, we want to keep it safe, of course, but not too safe, meaning we don't necessarily try to avoid any discomfort, anything difficult. The way people talk about it sometimes, if you think of that window of tolerance, where like down here is like shut down, numbed out, and up here is like too agitated, we want to stay in the window, but sometimes we want to be right up to the edge so that there's some discomfort that can lead to growth and change. So it's that mix of safety and challenge that I think characterizes all therapy and specifically trauma work as well. All right. Well, that was, of course, a lot that I threw at you, and I have no idea if it was mostly new or you mostly knew all this already or whatever. So either way, if there's anything in all of that that you want to follow up on or hear more about, I'm happy to talk more, hear more, whatever you'd like.
Well, thank you. You certainly gave us a lot to think of in that 30 minutes or so. A lot of points were made about trauma and responses to trauma and how the therapy experience can help you deal with it. So if anyone has any questions or comments, I encourage you to unmute yourselves and ask them. And if you feel comfortable, also turn on your video camera and we can continue the discussion.
And you could also do it in the chat if you don't. I know some people don't like talking on Zoom, so that is totally fine too.
Yes.
If you don't have questions, I could throw the fun exercise at you, but let's see if people have questions for another moment. The questions, can I just say, could be just like you could say, could you talk more about this or that? Because there are a number of things that I know I just sort of touched on and said, oh, there's much more we could say about that. So if there's a particular thing that you just want a little more on, it could be that too. Whatever you like.
One thing I was wondering about as you were talking is, you mentioned at the beginning that what makes trauma different from just any old bad experience is that it lingers, it repeats on you, it stays with you, it doesn't fade away, it doesn't get resolved. And I'm wondering if that lingering aspect of trauma makes one more vulnerable to other traumatic experiences. Does one trauma sort of beget other traumas? You mentioned that often trauma is not one thing, but many things. And I'm wondering if not being able to deal with a traumatic experience makes you more susceptible to future trauma.
Yes, in many ways. And that is, I guess, well, it's one reason why, one of many reasons why things that happen in childhood are, no surprise, particularly bad, because they're happening at a time when the brain is developing, when there isn't the sort of other stuff to fall back on. And so, indeed, trauma can leave, any trauma can leave people vulnerable to the next. And, one way to think about that is sort of in terms of some of the things I was saying about effective trauma as being on, sort of high alert all the time, or not being in touch with your internal sensations, or not being able to tolerate internal sensations. One way to say that, to talk about that, is not really being able to help yourself to feel better. Not through any fault. Again, not because you're not good at it, but because of what I described, how that's an effect of trauma. So unfortunately, right, that makes it harder when the next thing comes along. Exactly so. So indeed.
Are adults able to deal with that better than children?
Deal with
It's
which,
because
sorry.
what you were just talking about, sort of breaking the cycle of it, to realize what's operating on you.
Hmm. Um, sure, yes, often. Depends on what life has been like before. Here are things we know, but they're true in all sorts of particular ways here, that the early years, the developing years, really just have a tremendous impact in so many ways, in terms of our sense of the world, in terms of just genuinely how the brain develops. So an adult who has had, doesn't have to be perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but a sort of, good enough, solid enough foundation, which is going to include things like a sense that I can turn to others for help, that other people, not everyone else in the world, but some other people, that other people as a concept can be a source of comfort. That if I'm feeling upset, let's say, and I turn to somebody, I can be helped to feel better. Remember all the things I was saying about part of trauma is feeling like the feeling will just last forever. Like it's this is how I'm going to feel all the time, as opposed to a sense that it can shift and change. If I've got a decent enough, first bunch of years of my life, and so I know all that, not just in a knowing, thinking kind of way, but like in my nervous system, then yeah, I'm going to be sort of better positioned to heal from the particular trauma. This is why some interesting recent research has suggested that people who've had what we call attachment trauma, like really difficult, I'll just shorthand that and say really difficult early experiences, and then have later bad stuff happen. Research that interests me a lot has shown that if we treat, so to speak, and I say that word treat, but I don't mean it in a sort of medical way, I mean it in the way I've just described. If we treat the attachment, the early stuff first, like kind of treat it in the order in which it happened, um, then healing the other stuff can go much more quickly. So in other words, if one had all kinds of attachment trauma and then later in life, they were in a terrible car accident or something, you don't start with that car accident. You start with the early stuff, and then resolving that later trauma actually goes more quickly. So it's kind of interesting. You do it in the order that it happened in a way.
Anybody else have any questions or comments or curiosities?
We're probably near the end of time, but yeah, there's some time if people would like. Otherwise, it's going to be on you, Aaron. All those notes you were taking, you can ask, right? All right, you know what? Just for fun, and people can take it or leave it, I'm going to throw out this one quick way, and nobody has to share. This is just a private exercise you can do, but it's one kind of, I think, fun, interesting way of many possible ones to notice, to catch as it's happening, one of your sort of typical reactions. Okay, so what's sort of fun about this is I can offer this to you without, like, nobody has to say to me anything that's going on inside you. You can keep it totally private. You don't have to share it at all, but you can have a kind of interesting time following along. All right, so it's like this. I'm going to invite you to imagine a particular scenario, and you're all just boxes on a screen. You can put it in your own mind however you want it to be. You can mess with the details a little bit if you need to. But it's something like this. You can make it, okay, some people do it like you've just started dating a new person. Or it could be a longtime partner. Or it could be a close family member. Like however you want it to be. But somebody who's either important to you or maybe they're becoming important, something like that. Somebody where their feelings about you matter to you. Okay. I'll tell it to you the way it sort of typically goes, but you can adjust it however. The typical way it goes, this is presented is like you've just started dating a new person. But you could throw it in any way you like. And You show up in a public place. This is kind of like a pre-COVID little exercise. You show up at maybe an outdoor cafe or a restaurant or something, or maybe it's a store. Well, let's make it a restaurant for the sake of this. And you see this person sitting there talking in a seemingly very intimate way with someone that you don't recognize. Okay, so you see that happening. First, catch your internal reaction. No one has to tell me, but notice in yourself, what do you think is going on? Like, how do you interpret that scenario? You see your person talking in what looks to you like a very intimate way with somebody else. And you can make it, people do make it in ways that would particularly worry you. Like if you're in a male-female relationship and you want to see that person with somebody, that of the opposite sex, however you want to construct it to make it particularly kind of, potential for some kind of feelings. Notice what you think is going on. Like what meaning you make, how you interpret that. And then once you've got that, next thing to imagine for yourself is, what do you do? What's your response in this little movie that's going on in your head? In other words, do you immediately just hightail it out of there? Do you storm up to them and get angry and confront them? Those are just a couple of examples. So whatever scenes you've got in your head, and if we were in a therapeutic conversation together, I might be asking you about what scenes are coming up in your head. Of course, I also might not need to, because it might be useful for you just to notice. But so what's the point of all that? Maybe if this worked for you, what you were able to sort of catch, meaning like catch in flight as it happened quickly, is your kind of default response to like threats to closeness. Like did you immediately have the story that they're cheating, or they've got a secret they didn't tell me about, or they like that person better than me, or like whatever, interpretations like that. Some people say that. And sometimes people say it not as, oh, that's the story I made, but well, I'm sure that's what it is. Like, what else could it be? People kind of go to certainty, right? As opposed to maybe curiosity, like, I don't know. I actually don't know. And it's not necessarily terrible. And since I don't know, I can find out, that kind of thing. And then, this is kind of fun and interesting, the what came to you, if you were able to catch your immediate response, what came to you to do. Like when people tell me this stuff, they often tell it like it's just obvious, like it's not one of many choices, it's just what you do. So people say like, I would go right up and I would confront them. Or people say, oh no, I would immediately, I couldn't bear it, I'd get out of there. And this is not a test where there's a right or wrong answer. It's really not. It's an opportunity to notice, what is your default? What is your habitual response? So that I just throw it out to you as one of many possible examples of the kind of thing that might go on in therapy. That it would be like, let's just notice. This is not getting the right answer on a quiz, but it's recognizing what you typically do internally, what typically happens inside you. Because as I said in everything I presented, first step is noticing. First step is curiosity. What is happening inside me? What has become the typical way that I respond? Because I've got to notice it first before I even have a chance of being able to sort of play with different ways I might respond. So like in that scenario, the person who says, well, I'm sure that this is bad news, and my obviously what I'm going to do is go and fight. And again, remember everything I just brought up today. Someone who says that's their typical response, they've come by that honestly. They've got at one time that must have been a protective, adaptive story to make. Maybe people were very frequently unreliable. Maybe going and fighting and confronting was the most effective thing at one time. So you connect this with what I said earlier. But is doing that just reflexively all the time now helpful? Is it sometimes getting in the way? People tell the story of like, what if it was in the example where I first learned this, it's like it's actually the person's sister. It's actually really benign. And here's this person, and they went up and they yelled and they got all upset and they made a mess of things when in fact there was no need to. So sometimes responding in our originally helpful ways now gets in our way. So it's just sort of, it's a fun, or maybe you found it not so fun, maybe you found it quite unsettling. But it's just one example of so many that I could give you of how we might in therapy, one way or another, invite ways of noticing. What is the way I typically respond? And wow, what if that isn't just the way it has to be? What if that's one of many possible ways? And what if I have options? And sometimes people say to me something like, okay, but what if it actually is really necessary in the present to fight, to go and be angry, or whatever it might be? And we say, well, it's not that you never want to use that old strategy. You just want to have choices, right? Like it is necessary to be able to assess when a stove is hot. So therapy isn't about throwing out all those old adaptations. It's just about actually making it one of many choices as opposed to being stuck. So I bet everybody's glad I didn't ask you what was in your head with that scenario, but it's a way to come at some things. And then once you get used to doing this, you actually find yourself doing it, I think, more frequently just in life, noticing, oh, wait, that's what my immediate reaction was. Okay, that's interesting that's what I went to. If you do this in a group, if one does this in a group, like if we were not, a presentation at a library, but let's say a therapy group, people might be sharing, oh, well, I was sure that it was this. And the other one says, oh, I was sure it was that. And then you get to hear, wait a minute, the way I assume things are isn't the way everybody does. And that's interesting too. So there you go. That's my little additional PS offering. Any last thoughts or questions before we wrap up?
What you just said made me think of another question relating to something you said towards the beginning, that you said in trauma, the body reacts as though the event, the traumatizing event, is actually happening now. And I'm wondering if part of therapy involves the type of learning that you were just talking about now, learning to differentiate or disambiguate the bodily response to the memory of the trauma from the actual trauma itself. That I'm thinking that maybe in people who were gripped by trauma, their body controls them. The bodily memory of that trauma controls them so much that they can't tell the difference when they're actually in danger, when the stove is actually hot and when it isn't. And that the therapy that benefits them is a learning that helps them differentiate between those two things.
Yes, I think, tell me if I'm understanding the comment. I think I am. The thing is, I guess a thing is that the traumatized person doesn't know its memory.
Right.
I mean, that's really the whole interesting thing. Once you, even though thinking about painful memories, talking about painful memories, even though all of that is not exactly a good time, that can be very, very difficult and challenging, it's still, believe it or not, better. Once you know it's a memory, this happened. If it happened, as opposed to it's happening now, if it happened, it's over. And there's actually the possibility that things are different now. So, right, the body is responding. The body doesn't know. Like the body in that, if the body's having a trauma reaction, the body thinks it's happening now. And so, yes, a lot of therapy is about differentiating. But not, see, the tricky thing is not by saying, I mean, worst case would be, don't be ridiculous. There's no wild lion coming at you now. Why are you getting like, it's, we have to understand that it's not ridiculous at all. It's not crazy at all. And sometimes people are very relieved just to hear that. Okay, I'm not crazy. I'm not crazy that I ran out of that party when I saw the person with the green hat. Feels crazy. It's not crazy. But so it is about learning to differentiate, but through all kinds of means, such as I just very briefly began to describe. And sometimes I'll say to people about something that they're responding to, I'll say, well, it's not wrong. It just might be outdated. I'll say about some sort of way of understanding oneself in relation to others, or, there's all kinds of ways we behave to protect ourselves.
How do people respond? Because they don't feel that it's outdated, though. They feel like it's quite visceral.
It can be kind of astonishing though, to say like, okay, wait a minute, it's not like I have some stupid, bad, understanding of the world at one time. It's so much less negative, less there's something wrong with you or you have a disease. It's like, yeah, this is why I said at the beginning, maybe it's a nice place to wrap up. I said trauma is so moving to me because it's such an example of how humans are just always trying to survive. And so if surviving meant, take some of these other examples that I threw out, if survive, the best chance of survival was to not seem interested in stuff or to not speak up for yourself, you know, and then that's what one will do. A lot of what we do in therapy is we might sort of inquire, um, well, what does it feel would happen if you stop doing that thing? So let's say a person is always, I don't know, they're always interrupting people, let's just say as a simple example. And we might say, what does it feel would happen if you didn't do that? They might say, if I didn't do that, I'd never get to say anything, or some other bad thing that they talk about the danger. So I'm just trying to give you the sense that it's not just like lion coming at you. It might be within my family. This was dangerous. This was emotionally dangerous. It's my experience that people can be very relieved to begin to consider that the thing is not wrong. It just maybe things are different now. And this is what your question, Aaron, is also why this isn't like a one-time thing. It's not like, okay, here's the information that things are safer now and we're all good. It's a process over quite a time.
I think, though, and correct me if I'm wrong here, I mean, I think sometimes people's response to, say, a triggering event that relives the trauma is not to repeat what happened earlier, but in fact to do the opposite. Maybe at the time of the original trauma, they were silent and wished they weren't silent. And then when they get triggered again, they scream, they yell, they do the opposite of what they did the first time, almost trying to compensate for what they wished they had
Mm.
done.
It's interesting. I think, or my understanding of these terms is that wouldn't be a trigger response because a trigger is the kind of reflexive, do the thing that worked at the time. Doing,
Reliving it.
I'm sorry.
Reliving it. It's
Yeah,
like,
right. Like doing, like the brain goes, that's what kept us alive originally. So do it now, kind of. Um, Whereas some of your interesting suggestions there are actually on the path toward healing, weirdly enough, doing it different. It can be actually very helpful if done in a thoughtful way. I said very briefly in my presentation part that some of the body therapies that are really effective are where people are given opportunity to do the thing they couldn't do. Exactly so, like people who survived something terrible by shutting down and being immobilized will maybe get to in a very safe way act the pushing someone away or speaking up as you say or it's what you describe is actually a lot of what can happen in therapy. Do the thing you didn't get to do and need to do. So I guess my thought is that once somebody's doing that, they're already kind of on the way to healing.
except if their response is actually destructive, which it could be.
Hmm. Well, and if it's right, it has to be in a safe, contained way. Like a simple example, of course, is the one I just gave. If a person had in their bodies that need to push someone away, fight somebody off, fight back, and they didn't get to do that, it's not going to be wonderful if they just go around doing that, in life. But if in a very safe, kind of protected environment, they can do certain kinds of activities that help express that impulse, then it can actually be really wonderful. And then they don't have to do it out there in the world, So, yeah. People talk about how it can be helpful to complete the action, the thing that you sort of needed to do but didn't get to do. So, yeah.
All right.
Well,
Well, one last chance. If there are any other questions or comments, otherwise I think we will wrap it up and
Thank you.
thank Susannah for her time and interesting thoughts and sharing her experience with the many people she's worked with and interviewed and thought about and written about in her experience and practice.
Thank you all.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Take care and have a good night.